we have Nathan Waller in the room with us already. Hi, Nathan. Thank you for being with us today. So Nathan is the lead teacher trainer for Macmillan Education in the MENA region. He's a really experienced teacher trainer and is going to be talking to us and answering your questions about inclusivity today. So if you have any questions, just type them in the chat box. We'll gather them and I'll ask them to Nathan when he's done with his introduction. So over to you, Nathan. I'll pull up your slides and enjoy. I'm always here, so if you need anything, just give me a shout.
Perfect. Thank you, Federica. Hello, everybody, and good afternoon from a very sunny Dubai. I hope everybody is well and safe wherever you are. I say good afternoon, but it might be good morning, good afternoon, could be good evening. Or for some people, I saw someone from El Salvador where it's a bit more like, how on earth are you actually awake? It's like 5 o'clock in the morning or something. So there's a lot of people from a lot of places in the world, and it's amazing to see all of you. I saw someone from Malaysia, Salamat Datang to you. Someone from Peru, ¿Cómo estás? How are you? 6:30 in the morning, amazing, oh my God. Who else have we got? We got Turkey. I've seen some people from the MENA region, Qatar. Thanks very much. Brazil, Kazakhstan, Georgia. Oof. If you haven't sat on a terrace in Tbilisi with a khachapuri, you haven't lived, I don't think. All of these amazing places. A lot of them I've been to, but some of them I have not. China, of course, it's Chinese New Year, I think. It starts today or tomorrow? So, Gongqi Fatai. My pronunciation is probably terrible. It's been a long time since I lived in China. But amazing to see you all here today, and I hope you've got some great questions. I'm certainly happy to be here with you. We're going to be covering the topic of inclusion or inclusive education. And you may have noticed recently that inclusion has kind of come to the forefront of discussions around education, given the impact that the pandemic has had. For those of you from MENA, you probably do know who I am. I'm the teacher trainer for MENA. I cover a very large area, everything from Morocco in the west through to, I don't know, Pakistan maybe in the east. North and south as well. 18 countries I think we have in total. And I bring that up because MENA is an incredibly diverse area, culturally, linguistically, economically, socially, environmentally. A lot going on within the MENA context. So inclusion and diversity is something that we've been tackling recently, which is why I was brave enough to take on this session, I think. When it comes to Sustainable Development Goals, of which education is one of them, it's number 4. If you're not familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals, it's actually there, enshrined. Every country has signed up to it. Ensuring inclusive and equitable quality education and promoting lifelong learning opportunities for all, for everybody. Now, obviously, we know with recent progressions that in many ways, some of the developments or some of the progress that we've been making in terms of education has actually been reversing. So this question again is coming up over and over again. How do we ensure access to quality education for children in situations where adults can't seem to get along or in situations where it's affected by global pandemics, etc.? And while equal access is perhaps the first step to developing an inclusive education, I think we need to take this a little bit further. Yes, there's definitely places in the world where access is an issue, but I think for the guys who are probably with us now, we want to think more about inclusive educational practices within our school. What can we actually do? What kind of practical things can we do in our classrooms, in our schools, to make education more inclusive for the children and the students that we already have? So that is what we're going to work together to address today. And I say that because you've signed up for a question and answer session. They've called it an Ask the Expert session. And I really take that to heart. That's really what this session is actually going to be. So I will be pitching questions to you guys as much as I will be answering your questions, which I will come to in a bit. Why? Because for me, I think the real expertise is contained in the, we've got, it's keep going up, but nearly 1,000 people, perhaps, in the room. So there's a wealth of expertise in this room across the world right now, all engaging with education at the moment. So I think we need to draw on that as much as possible. Greetings from Albania, amazing. So I appreciate the questions might not be that easy to think of when it comes to inclusive education. A couple have come in already, I've seen, and Federica is going to be taking them down. I'm collaborating some of them. But I thought for the first kind of 10, 15 minutes, I would kind of go through a slightly more structured approach and build that around some of the questions that we've had here in the MENA region around what is inclusion? How can we make that happen? How can we support special educational needs and disability students, etc.? These kinds of questions, the more kind of broad questions. So how about we start with that? It might throw up some more questions for you, some deeper questions that we can then tackle together in the second part. So let's start with our first very broad question. We won't do too much on it or waste too much time here. But our first question is, what is inclusion? This is what we're looking at today. Traditionally related more to special educational needs and disabilities. But now it's kind of a bit more broad than that, a bit more all-encompassing, I think. Some of the terms you might be familiar with already, but our aim is to get a little bit deeper under the skin of these and how they mean different things to and are experienced differently by different people. That's kind of at the core of what we're doing. Now, I do think that inclusive education does mean different things to different people. So let's start by flipping this around to you guys. And we'll start with this. I'd like you to finish this statement. What does inclusive education mean to you? So inclusion is, we've got someone already, growing up together in mind and soul. Diversity, we're going to discuss that in a second. Absolutely. I'll give you a minute to think about this. I'll have a sip of tea. Integration, caring, same opportunities to everyone, adaptability. Chat box is moving too fast, I can't see. Different cultures, collaboration. Yeah, it's kind of, we're really getting this all-encompassing. Equity, good, I'm glad to see that word. Okay, good. Now I expected the chat box to move quite quickly and not be able to keep up. So I took 3 statements. These are from teachers here in MENA. They're not referenced, so we're not pulling anybody out. But 3 statements that I think help us to see inclusive education as an ideal. I don't think we'll ever be able to see an actual full inclusive education in reality. For example, if I was to go to a school, I met a principal at the front gate, and he said to me, "Welcome to the Global School of whatever. We have spent 5 years making this the most inclusive school ever. It caters to every single student." And I'd be like, "Oh, it looks amazing, but I need to stop you there for a second because schools are closed, so nobody's going to be coming here." So already this idea of the pandemic has thrown in our face that how do we create an inclusive education, an inclusive school? Lots of questions come up around this. But I do see inclusive education as perhaps a journey, as a pathway. And I think these 3 statements lead us along that pathway quite nicely. So the first one is, inclusive education is about gathering all pupils in the same place. Now, I'm not going to disagree with this statement. I think, yeah, absolutely. It's about students having the opportunity to learn equally among their peers. That's a kind of broad definition of inclusive education. Nothing wrong with that. But can we make improvements to this statement? I think maybe we can. So I pulled out another one. Meeting the needs of students with additional needs and helping them participate in the classroom and learn. So now we've moved on from this idea of access, getting students into the classroom together and thinking about what they're actually going to be doing. What are we doing to adapt what we're doing to ensure that they are actually participating and getting the most out of them? So I think this is a little bit further along the pathway than the first one, but can we improve on this even further? I think, yes, perhaps we probably can. So I pulled this one out. We did this with around 200 teachers here in MENA. So there was a lot of great ideas. The third one, an approach to educating individuals through including them in all of the activities worked on, despite their differences, and through using those differences, which I think really takes this to kind of the next level. You know, we're not just trying to get them to participate in what we are trying to do with them. We're actually using their strengths. We're using their interests. We're bringing all of that out. So taking that kind of inclusive approach even further. Can we go even further than this again? I'm sure we can. It would be nice towards the end if we could come up with something a little bit even more holistic than this. So the next question people usually ask when we talk about inclusion is, how can we make inclusion happen? This is probably going to be one of the questions that comes up, I would have thought. In order to address this question, we need to think about diversity. So I have a couple of questions here. You're more than welcome to think about them. And if you want to write something in the chat box, you're more than welcome. How much diversity is there in your teaching context? Now, I mentioned that I'm here in MENA, and there is a lot of diversity. But within an individual school, sometimes people think, you know, especially if it's a same-sex school, it could be, well, they're all boys, they're all the same age, they all kind of like the same thing, they all kind of get the same kind of grades. Yeah, they're all, you know, not much diversity. But actually, I think there is a lot of diversity, even in what could look like quite homogeneous groups of students. And we'll move on to that a little bit in a second. In your context, what does this diversity look like? We've already mentioned that we've got people here, hundreds of people from all over the world, and each context is going to look different. So your approach to inclusive education will take different forms and shapes depending on who your students are and what is important to them. Now, we talk about diversity because at the end of the day, are we like the sign on the toilet door? Are we just this kind of blank, I am a male? I think really we all know that the answer to that is no. There are many things that make us who we are. We don't have a lot of time because we want to move on to the questions, but have a little look around. There's a few good YouTube videos around the ideas around intersectionality, and that's really important here. Not just which aspects of me come out strongest, but what other areas are important to our students, and how can we bring that into the classroom as much as possible. So it could be gender, sex, it could be religion, it could be all sorts of things. It could even be down to body shape and size. And how do we bring this into the classroom? And yeah, and have them accept who they are, but have them accept who other people are as well. Our role is very much to incorporate that. That's just the self. What about what's going on outside of the self? Of course, there's lots of other things going on, lots of spheres of influence around us. Family, school, community, the blue area could just be globally. How do different influences in our lives drag us in different directions? How does that create conflicts internally and between people? And also, how does that set up barriers to learning or areas of exclusion? We need to take these things into account. Are these things working in harmony? Is the school and the family on the same page? Are they embedding the values of that particular community? These kinds of things. Okay, I want to think also a little bit around exclusion. So I want to again pitch this to you guys. Have you ever been or have you ever felt excluded? Now I want you to sit back in your chair, take a moment, and think about the journey you've made to where you are now. What has it taken to get you here? So sit back, have a look at yourself. You are beautiful, by the way, each and every one of you. Look at yourself, think about your journey, think about how you got to where you are right now. Think about what barriers you have experienced along the way. They may have been barriers in school. They may be barriers within your workplace. Think about how and where you've been excluded. Sometimes you may not have actually been excluded, but you felt like you were excluded. Yeah, there's a lot of people talking here about the emotional aspects of this. Do you carry with you some of these things today? Which part, when we're thinking about the intersectionality part, which areas of your life do you feel included and which ones do you feel excluded? And how do they overlap? How do they create conflicts? So have a think about some of those things. If you're working in education, you are making a difference to the students that you work with. Sometimes it doesn't feel like that when you have the challenges of school, especially now if you're doing online learning. Yes, I mean, people are putting some amazing comments here. But teachers really make a difference to their students' lives. All of those things that Joanne was talking about in the previous session, getting them to interact, getting them to collaborate. If you've seen some of the sessions before, like Viv's session talking about students sharing and learning values through the stories that they're interacting with, these are key. Because whether we like it or not, we do have an impact on the students. And how they're going to respond to these particular questions around exclusion is going to depend on how we interact with them now in the present. I'd also like, because I want us to really think about the impact that we have on our students. I was reading something the other day, and this really jumped out at me. I read a lot because of the type of job that I have, and it's very easy to be desensitized to these kinds of facts or quotes, but this one really jumped out at me. The quote was from the Sustainable Development Goals, and it was that a child whose mother can read is 50% more likely to live past the age of 5. Now, immediately you could just kind of, oh, okay, whatever, that's a fact, flip that on. But actually, that really jumped out at me, and I was like, wow, this is a really amazing statistic. And I want to contextualize that for you guys, to put that into perspective. So think about the girls who are in your classrooms now. Think about them at the end of the academic year, May, June, July, if you're where I am. Think about those girls in July, and think about where they were last September and how much progress they've made in terms of reading between September and July in one academic year, based on the input that you've had. Think about what's happened in those 10 months, 9 months, whatever it is. You know, when it comes to them learning to read, yes, they've made progress, and that might help them to get a job when they're older, and that's where we generally feel proud of ourselves. But actually, there's a little bit more to it than that. If you've created a fully inclusive environment, if you've adapted the reading materials to make it more inclusive, to make it more accessible, maybe you've personalized the readings to make it more meaningful, then those girls have learned to read, or they've progressed in reading. Reading is a long process that takes place over probably more than 1 year, but you've contributed to that. So you've not just contributed to them learning to read, you've actually potentially saved their as yet unborn child's life. And for me, that's like that's a real wow moment for me. And I think that really makes what we do as teachers really stand out. And I think that's why inclusion really is at the heart of everything we do to me. Anyway, drifting off topic a little bit. So we want to move beyond this idea of an inclusive education as being something that's just equal for everybody. This comes up a lot. I've seen this particular diagram come out because it wants to move from equality to equity. How do we make the system more fair around justice? But actually, a fully inclusive education takes this even further. Is the elephant just an elephant? What other aspects of the elephant make him an elephant? Maybe sometimes he feels like a penguin, sometimes, who knows? So we need to go beyond this and think about why it is that we should strive for an inclusive education. Inclusive education, as we know, is about more than special educational needs and disabilities. It's about all pupils, because at some point in their learning journey, they're going to need some form of support during their time at school. Empathy is another one. So we've been talking a lot around emotions. Can we learn empathy? I think yes, we can. And that is learned from being exposed to those people who are different to us. And, you know, again, if we go back to the story central, let's think about Viv's session on Sunday. Those, you know, really rich stories that help children not just learn how to read, but really identify with certain characters, certain perspectives, and also share their ideas and share their experiences in the classroom is really important on their progress to learn to read. Now, I'm sure you all want kind of practical things that teachers can do in the classroom. I'm literally going to whiz through these very quickly. The first thing is to accept that you already have special educational needs and disability students in your classes. So they say, I can't remember the statistic off the top of my head, but something like 1 in 10 people in the world have dyslexia. So if you have a classroom of 30 students, there's a good chance that 2 or 3 of them or more are going to have dyslexia. That's just the way things are going to be. And it's probably going to be undiagnosed. And the student themselves probably won't even know that that's why they're struggling. And I've had lots of situations when I was teaching in the past where teachers will say, oh, I've got this student and he's got behavioral problems. And actually, after some work, analyzing, talking to the parents, spending time with the student, they realize that actually those behavioral problems are a way of a coping mechanism of masking the issues that they really have. So we've got to get under the surface and communicate with our students as much as possible. Focus on talents, interests, and abilities. SEND is often seen in the negative context, but actually I think we need to start with, for all students, with what are their interests, what are they passionate about? How can we start there? Recording stuff is important. Not just data, but also narratives that go on within the classroom. I really like Joanne's session. A lot of that is about students talking, students communicating with each other. How do we record that? How do we build that up? And how do we ensure that those values are not just individually taught, but carried throughout the entire school year? Remember, you may be rectifying the errors of others. So if you're the grade 3 teacher and the grade 1 and grade 2 teacher, didn't really do very much, they focused on the strong students because that's who they want to get through the class. These guys, well, there's 4 students, let's just put them to one side. Can't do everybody. You might need to be working on some of the issues that the student has, building up their confidence once again. Important as an extension to that is to build a framework of continuous professional development with the school around this, creating safe spaces so that teachers can share their experiences around working with all different types of students. Think about the curriculum. How can your curriculum create barriers to learning? It will in a multitude of ways. Can all of your students access the curriculum in an equal way, in an equitable way? So think about that. If you're in the UK, you have things like IEPs. This is individual plans for students with special needs. But in many ways, if you've been joining some of the other sessions that have talked about things like portfolio work, how can we create individualized plans for all students so that they can make their own goals? Sometimes things can be changed very simply. If you think about, if you're an Academy Stars user, for example, it has dyslexic-friendly font throughout the book. So changing the fonts can make the content more accessible. One of the things teachers very often don't think about is they make supplementary materials. They say, I'm going to make these worksheets, and they photocopy them, 30. But actually, the color of the paper can influence whether or not somebody can actually do that task with ease. Simple things like pencil grips, so that students don't need to focus on the motor skills as much. They can concentrate on getting their ideas down onto paper. Very small things like this can make a big difference. Lighting, glare is a big one. In the office, if there's glare on my laptop, I get a headache. After an hour, I need to move. These kinds of things are also important in the classroom as well. And also layouts. Layouts is a really big one for me. How does the layout of your classroom, I know some of you are teaching online at the moment, but think about if you are in the classroom or if you're going to go back to the classroom, how did you lay out your classrooms? Were all the desks facing the front? What is the front? What's the purpose of the front? If all the desks face towards the whiteboard or the interactive whiteboard, you're creating a power dynamic in your classroom. You're saying the whiteboard is more important than the students, I think. So think about how you set up. Are they in groups? How do those groups move? How do you navigate throughout the classroom? These kinds of things. If you're trained in special educational needs, you will know that they need more time, but lots of students need more time. Think about the activities that you set. Do you allow enough time for processing the information? Or are your questions to them kind of very direct? What can you see? What color is it? You don't know the answer? Let's move on to the next person. Give them processing time. It's really important. Awareness raising in your own context. And at the heart of much of what we do is differentiation. And there are these various areas, which I'm sure you're hopefully very familiar with. How do you differentiate the environment, the content, the methods, and also methods of assessment? So these are some practical things. I kind of raced through them because I realized time is getting on. And you may be asking yourself, okay, but this is 2021. Is all of this stuff really possible? Yes, if I was in the classroom in 2019, yeah, maybe I could take some of these things into account. But everything is chaos at the moment. How do I actually make any of these kinds of things happen? I think it's definitely possible. It's absolutely possible to create more inclusive learning environments, even if it is online. And a lot of that is around better models of cooperation. How do you communicate with parents? How are parents involved in decision-making processes? What networks, wider networks can we rely on now that we're all connected to the internet and internet activities in different ways? Are we connecting or taking advantage of a lot of the things that are out there? Technology is a big one. Each other, how are you supporting each other at the moment in terms of supporting students? Students are always your biggest resource in any classroom. Rely on them. They are way more empathetic. They are way more compassionate than we often give them credit for. They can give you ideas for how to include different types of students and how they feel about that. So rely on that as well. Publishers I put there, you guys have all come today, so engaging with the publishers and what we're doing, finding out what we're doing, but also informing what we're doing so that we can continue to make that better. I did try to think of some of the things that the publishers are doing right now. I mentioned Academy Stars. We've mentioned the kind of types of stories in Story Central. Mimi's Wheel is a really nice one, the way that it's been designed. So think about your students when they do writing in the course book. So, I mean, I've done this before. They open the book up and they use their kind of left elbow to kind of pin down the page, when they're writing. But what if they're left-handed? That's actually not that easy to kind of coordinate. So we've designed this book so that it lays flat first on the table, and then when you open it, it opens front-facing. Doesn't matter the direction of writing, which hand that you are. It breaks down one particular barrier to learning that students might have. And I hope that we see a lot more of that in the published material, taking these things into account. Lots of things like Global Stage have differentiated activities in them to help you as teachers create different types of activities within the classroom. And some of them just have practical tip books like Optimize if you're teaching secondary students. So these are some of the things that Macmillan are doing at the moment, but can we do better? We absolutely can. We try to rely on the external, the fact that we're part of the Springer Nature group. So bringing that kind of academic expertise into and embedding that into our course books is really important. But we also create other ththings. It could be things like these handouts for teachers. What can you do to help a dyslexic student, which we can easily share with you through the website. But it actually needs to go a little bit further than that as well. So, we have created things to try to get as much input from you guys as possible. This is one way, having a question and answer type of session. But also we have something like the index, the Insights Index. So if you're not involved with that, get involved. And you can find it on the Macmillan English website and give your feedback so that we can improve the way that we work, which will help you to improve the way that you teach, which will lead to better outcomes for hopefully more students in the classroom. We've got halfway, I think. So I've covered a lot there. Let's see if there's anything super important that I didn't touch upon. The next was, okay, I'm on board, but I know I have children with special educational needs in my class. I want to help them. And we're supposed to promote inclusion, but I'm not really sure how to do this. Anybody kind of feel this way? I'll take a moment to have some tea. Talked a lot. If this is an area that you're struggling with, I've got a few slides around special educational needs, but let's take a moment to see, let's bring Federica back in. Let's see if there's any questions that have come up so far around the kind of broader area of inclusion and inclusion within the classroom.
Thanks, Nathan. Can you hear me?
I can, yes, be quiet, but yeah, I can hear you.
Perfect. So yeah, thank you for this great tips so far and ideas. And I think some things that you said especially resonated with people in chat box that we're talking about left-handed people.
Yeah.
So that's great. And we did get a few questions about some of the topics that you touched already on. So shall we go with them now?
Yeah, let's do it.
So at the very beginning, there was someone asking, what is the difference between inclusion and belonging? And how can we create a bigger sense of belonging for students?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think that belonging is one aspect of perhaps a bigger umbrella term, which is to bring, I think, emotions into the teaching and learning of students. I think belonging fits kind of neatly within that bigger umbrella. And I would say emotions is kind of at the heart of inclusive education, creating an education system that's more about building and fostering relationships between students and between them and the teacher, them and each other, but also them and their wider networks as well. So all of those types of things can lead, I think, to a sense of belonging. Belonging is about, I think, self-worth. It's about connectivity. So what we're doing within the rapport somebody's putting there, and we can use the materials that we have to build that rapport. So, if you think about when I taught in somewhere like Oman more than a decade ago, I think about the materials that I used then and whether or not they were designed to help me build that rapport with students. Quite often, very old textbooks were not. They were more kind of linguistic. They were, we're going to do the vocabulary, and then we're going to do the grammar, and then we're going to do the reading. Then I'm going to try and get you to speak, even though you might not be able to. And then we're going to move on to the next unit. And I think if you look at things like, share it, that sense of belonging is now embedded into the activities. So the reading is not just, can you do this particular piece of reading? It's, can you think about this reading more broadly? Can you relate to this reading? Is this how you feel? Is this your experience? And we've seen that again in the other ones, in Viv's session, and certainly with Joanne's session, building this sense of belonging within the group. And I think that's at the heart of teaching and learning, above the assessment part.
Yeah, no, that's great answer. Thank you. There was Arlene asking, what if you have 40 students in the classroom? Is inclusivity really possible, and how can you implement that?
Yes, good. Again, this is a kind of question that I would expect on this session. So I probably should have prepared for it, right? But no.
Sure you did.
Yeah, I'm sure I did. Yes, it is, I think, very possible to cater even to very large classes. I have taught very large classes as well. I've been in classrooms with up to 50 children in remote parts of Malaysia, where they didn't even have electricity. So, and there are a lot of ways that we can adapt what we're doing. The first thing I think, and I hope this came out when I was doing the first part of the presentation, is that we need to work from the students out. So we need to think about their interests. We need to get to know them. I know that's really difficult when the group is very large. One of the things that lots of teachers do is to think, well, I've got 40 students, but if I break them into groups, that could be 10 groups of 4, or whatever it is. So to make it more manageable, you could put them into different types of groups. Think about who's in the group. People often group according to ability, but actually I think it's good to have weaker students with stronger students, but within a smaller group. So all your groups don't always need to be the same size. It doesn't have to be 10 groups of 4. You're better off having big groups of capable students together working on a project, and then smaller groups of students who might need a bit more support where you can focus your attention on them. Yeah, so it's kind of about how we manage the classroom there a little bit.
Thank you. And I think it also answers to Katerina's question pinned at the top of the chat box. Basically, it was not really a question, it's a comment saying that she feels like she is neglecting a part of her classrooms if she focuses on some students specifically. Do you have any advice for her?
Yeah, I mean, it's a case of just being conscious, I guess. It's about, part of it is about thinking ahead. It's about planning in terms of perceived barriers to learning that might come up. So we were talking about, small steps, tiny things that you can do that will help certain students to achieve more or better outcomes. But also sometimes I think, and I've seen this in kind of teacher training sessions on observations, is that teachers will often, they will be like, okay, I have this particular student and they've got a learning difficulty. So they tend to keep them very close. Yeah. And then, yes, if those students have frustrations, it can lead to behavioral issues within the classroom. But we need to think about, well, okay, if I'm keeping them close to me, what are the consequences of that? How is that affecting their ability to collaborate with the rest of the group? How does it affect how the other group sees them? So take these kinds of things into account as well. Patience, someone's mentioning patience here. A lot of this is down to patience, I think. And just perhaps thinking ahead, play a kind of mental game of educational chess and be 2 steps ahead of whatever's going to happen.
Thank you. And I also agree with Karina saying that if you teach your other students to just be patient, indeed, they will learn something much more important and even bigger than just the academic things that you're teaching them.
Yeah, absolutely.
There was a really interesting question from Marissa asking, how can we encourage mainstream teachers to observe inclusion in the classroom? So when it's down to your colleagues, not just your students.
Let's think about that question. I think that's probably relates to the slide we had on kind of models of cooperation. I do think that it's really important for schools to develop inclusion policies. So one of the things I didn't mention, that kind of the foundation of an inclusive educational approach is, number one, values and ethos. So everybody needs to be on the same page about what it is you're trying to achieve within the school. Beyond that is policy. So actually putting that into something written so that everybody knows their expectations. Everybody knows what's expected of them as teachers, them as a community of teachers, and also for students as well. And the last one is practice, which I think we've talked a lot about. So there's this kind of methodology, I guess, of inclusive education. So perhaps working together as the team to kind of figure out, how can you develop better policies where everybody's looking for opportunities to break down those barriers to learning is key, I think, there.
Thank you. And there was another really interesting question coming from Luisito asking, how could we sustain inclusion and equity if in terms of socioeconomic status, children around the world are not equal? And maybe even in your classroom, you could have, people coming from different backgrounds. So how do you address that?
It's a difficult question to kind of know the answer off the cuff, I think. I would go to Google, type in intersectionality there, and look for one particular video. I can't remember what it's called, but it's got a yellow background. It's about, celebrating who we are. We are made up. We are multi-dimensional, complex people. And I think it's about celebrating all of the aspects of what makes us who we are, and how those things interrelate. So, how do you build relationships with other people? It's a difficult question to answer, but there's definitely a lot out there that can support you to get to the root of that answer, I think.
Yeah, and I think it's great to know that there's a lot of materials that we can actually use.
Yeah, huge amount, yeah.
And I'm asking you the difficult questions because you're the expert, so I'd love to hear the answers.
I'm taking this as a chance. With other people, so I should do it more.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm taking this as a chance to learn myself, so I'm just loving it.
Good, excellent. Was there any more questions, or should we have a little look at special educational needs?
Yeah, you can definitely go on, and yeah.
Okay, good. So We know that we have children with special educational needs. They are going to be in our classroom. In lots of parts of the world, they probably may not have a formal diagnosis. So you may just kind of end up with them in your classroom. So we need to think a little bit around how we approach the differences. We've had some questions around this, which is nice. Let's see if this will throw up any new questions for the last 10 minutes. So these are a few questions that I pitched to people here in MENA. What do you understand by the term SEND, special educational needs and disability? What falls under this term? Is this the most appropriate term? And this is where we've got to it in this particular progression of inclusive education. But in 100 years' time, will we look back and say, we should never have called it special educational needs and disability? It should have been called this. Yeah, there's always improvements in the future. Can you think of a more appropriate term? I'll leave that up to you guys. I'm from the UK, as you guys may already know. And you guys can continue to write your questions in the chat box. Federica will definitely keep on top of them. In the UK, special educational needs and disability has kind of gone through this progression. If you go back a couple of 100 years, there was kind of no access to educational opportunities at all. Then the kind of equal rights, equal access to education came in, but they were kind of segregated. They were kind of put in kind of external buildings or other schools. And then we went through this kind of model of integration, and we're now hopefully moving into this area of inclusion. That's the kind of progress. It started off in the kind of 1970s. But around the world, there will be different paths and progress that has been made. Now, of course, there's some tensions that exist. There's this tension between the right to an inclusive education, the right to learn equally among your peers, and the possibility of benefiting from inclusive education. And I think this relates to some of the questions that Federica just had. Yes, okay, getting them into the school and trying our best, but if they're not really benefiting from that, is inclusive education a goal that we as adults are kind of pushing people towards? Are we including the perspectives of students in that? I don't know. There's still some debate around that, I think. And that relates to this idea of kind of being on the inside, but kind of still on the outside. Yeah, you're technically in my classroom, but I'm teaching you differently. I feel like I've got two classes. I'm teaching the students and I'm teaching you guys. Yeah, and that can be problematic, I think, for teachers. We also need to think about the way that society is currently structured. So again, there's a very good video on YouTube. I'm not going to play it, but this idea that there's a town and everybody in the town is in a wheelchair. So they create the town, according to their needs. And then there's some, what they call able-bodied people move into the town, but they struggle, obviously, because the door heights are too low and this kind of thing. So it's a really interesting kind of flip on the way that society is and how we view what is classified as normal within society and how we structure society around that. And then also we have some ideas around attitudes as well. And that's one of the areas I do want to focus on, is this idea around attitudes and mindset. So when it comes to special educational needs, I would always say that disability definitely does not mean inability. I worked with special educational needs in the UK a long time ago now. And I did a lot of research around it at the time. And one of the things that really comes out is people with disabilities often say they are judged to be incapable in ways that they are not. So people who are in a wheelchair, people often assume that they have intellectual abilities as well, and they treat them accordingly. Another one is for people who are visually impaired. They may not be blind, they may just be visually impaired, but people often, when they speak to them, speak very slowly and very kind of loud, as if they have a hearing impairment as well. And they're like, I don't have a hearing impairment, I just have a visual impairment. And I need things adapted so that I can access accordingly. But the way that we see people, the way that we treat people is all based on our assumptions and judgments. And that's embedded in our belief systems and values as well. So what I'd like to do is actually, I'm going to switch. I'm going to show you a quick video. I'm going to take a few minutes because I think this video really nicely highlights the way that our judgments and our assumptions change according to to how our environment progresses. If you've seen this video before, go and grab yourself a cup of tea, save yourself the tears. Mute. Put my mic back on. Hopefully you can hear me again. Let's go back to the presentation. It's such a nice video, and it really highlights how we can have assumptions about our students and about the way that they feel. It's a really, really powerful video, I think. I've had to watch this video like 50 times just to manage to control myself. Okay, good. So a lot around this kind of assumptions, this kind of stuff around judgments. I did create a kind of scenario. So let's just say I'm your manager. I've got 1,000 teachers under my wing. I think I deserve a pay rise. But I come to you one morning and I tell you, you're going to be receiving a student. Maybe I'm in the staff room. Oh yeah, you're going to have a new student in your class this morning. And they've got special educational needs. So, immediately, kind of, how do you feel? What questions do you have? What would you do next? And this, I think, it can happen easily in schools. I'm sure it happens all the time in schools. I think a lot of time, the weight of dealing with students with special educational needs really falls on the shoulder of teachers. So building a supportive network for yourself, I think, is important. We mentioned that, I think, in one of the questions. How can you rely on, or how can you bring in as many stakeholders as possible? Parents, it could be organizations that support that particular type of need. Other teachers, it could be informal, asking, I've got an ADHD student who's just started in my class. Have you had an ADHD student in your class before? What kind of things did you do? How did you adapt some of your materials for them? And also remembering, as I said, the greatest resource, students. Talk to the student, get to know them, get to know what it is that they're passionate about, or what kind of fears they have. Do they have fears of fitting in? Do they have fears of failure? We talk a lot about well-being, and someone mentioned belonging, and working hard on that is key to making sure that that type of student progresses to their full potential, I think. I also put this, let's see if you agree or disagree, and then let's see if anybody has any final questions, perhaps more around special educational needs and how to deal with them. Agree with the statement, a regular teacher cannot really include a child with a disability in their class without additional resources and specialist training. And there's going to be a real mixture of opinions here. Some people are going to agree, some people are going to disagree, and that's absolutely fine. Yes, additional resources and specialist training would certainly help, but is it the only way that we can ensure that our students achieve their full potential? I don't know. It's a tough one. So I think I'm coming to the end. Does anybody have any more questions? Federica, have you seen any other questions or good questions that have come in that we want to address?
Thanks, Nathan. Someone was asking, in 2021, with the pandemic still going on and people having to be at home, basically, how can you actually address all of these needs when you're teaching in an online environment?
Again, very difficult. I appreciate the difficulty that people are currently going through. I think it's about just having a positive mindset in terms of how we approach it. And again, that network of support. So how can you build better systems of communication with parents? If you're at home and the student is at home, you need to kind of find another way to kind of reach that student. And the parents are one way to do that. We talk a lot about parents, but we need to think about other family members as well. Maybe they have siblings who can also help support. Sometimes we forget about the emotional impact that having a sibling with a special educational need can have. So sometimes we think, well, I don't have any students with special educational needs in my classroom, but actually they may have a sibling in another class, and that could impact what's happening for them. So these are more barriers that we need to approach and think about and plan for as teachers. So yes, it's very difficult, but I think that there are, and again, start small. We cannot change everything all in one go. Find small ways to get them involved. That could just be finding out the things that they're interested in and tailoring the materials to suit those particular interests. I'm sure there's lots of teachers out there right now who, before the pandemic, looked at some of their students and thought, hey, this student is really good. They're achieving a lot. And now in the online environment, that student is not doing so well. But it's also the same the other way around. There's probably students where they were like, I don't see this student becoming a B1 student by the end of primary. But in the online environment, wow, they're engaging with Navio, they're doing all these other things. And I never thought those things were possible. So we need to take all of that stuff and think about how in the future, if there is a post-pandemic, which hopefully there is, that those things are embedded, better systems of communication with parents, working from the student out, these kinds of things.
Thank you. That's a great point. And I think it also links really well with another question that we got, which is how would you deal with parents that are not so on board with sharing what their kids' needs are and so on?
I think generally when it comes to special educational needs, parents are quite open, or certainly my experiences in the past, they have been. Partly because if we're thinking about this from a parent's perspective, we deal with them in school. It's one area of their life, but that parent has gone through an entire emotional experience throughout that child's whole life, from finding out that they're going to have a child, or they've just had a baby with a particular type of need, and the challenges that they faced as they've been going through the early years, and accessing different types of schooling, making sure that their needs are met. So those types of parents, I think, are a lot more open. I think the challenge really comes when it comes to maybe students who have got difficulties which are either not diagnosed or maybe not accepted by parents for various reasons, cultural reasons, could be socioeconomic reasons, that they don't want to accept that that's actually what's actually the reason for why they're struggling, and they kind of expect the school to pick up the slack on that. So I know that can be very difficult. And again, I guess it's trying to find other more informal networks of support that can help you with that particular student, and I guess communicating with the student themselves, and trying to influence the parent through the student might help. It's a difficult one.
Thank you. We have another question actually, which is, what would you do if you were a teacher again? How would you address all of these things that we've been talking about?
Yeah, I wrote that question actually. I think it was originally on one of the slides.
It was, and then I think someone just picked up on that.
Yeah.
And they were like, we're giving you a scenario now.
First of all, I would attend a Macmillan question and answer webinar on inclusivity, definitely. That would be the first thing I would do. So thankfully they're here and engaging with that. Start small, think of very practical ways, communication with other people. I think these are the key things, really. Start with the student. Always work from the student out.
Thank you. And I think we have time for one more, and it came up quite a few times, and it was, how would you possibly edit or adapt your materials if they're not already ready for the situations?
Yeah. Not sure I get the question exactly.
I think it was, if you have materials that do not take into account all of these needs and diverse scenarios, how do you adapt them if you can't change the materials?
I'm not sure, actually. I think really the materials they're a resource. So if we are thinking, again, from the student's perspective, we can always adapt what it is that we're doing in terms of how the students are actually using those materials. So yeah, you could take a worksheet, and you can, if you're thinking about differentiation, you can use that worksheet in so many different types of ways. But I think it's thinking about the content, what it is that worksheet is trying to achieve, and then thinking, well, are there other ways that the students could achieve this? The reading is a great example. Yes, they can read the book from the course book, but we also have the ability to put that story on an interactive whiteboard, they can listen to that story without you having to read it. So you could read it, they could listen to it from the interactive whiteboard, from Navio or the Me application. They can engage with it visually. You could break it up. You could photocopy and put parts of the story in different places. There's lots of different ways, I think, that students can engage. I think really it's more about making sure that that content is accessible to as many people as possible, and then seeing what they can do with it, making the activities as collaborative as possible, so that they can really share their experiences. I think that's really key, and that's come out in again, like I said, the other webinars a lot.
Thank you. So if you guys have any other questions, maybe just one more, but there was someone commenting on the fact that even training materials for teachers and even the training style is changing, and it's kind of evolving in this direction. What do you think about that?
Yeah, and I think that's key as well. I really like the idea of the teacher training should model what we want teachers to do in the classroom with their students. So, I've seen lots of webinars, and in the past conferences, teacher training sessions, and very often I feel like perhaps we're not that good at modeling what it is we want teachers to actually do. We're doing with them what we're telling them not to do with students. So I think there is a lot of progress that we can make in that area as well, and we're trying. If you're in MENA, hopefully you see that we're trying that.
And on that hopeful note, thank you, Nathan. It was
You're
really
most
great.
welcome. Yeah, thank you.
Of course, I think
It was
we
a
all
real
learned
pleasure.
a lot.
I hope so.
So yeah, thank you so much. And
You're
thanks
welcome.
everyone for attending. We know how busy you are, so thank you so much for that. And of course, thanks to Will Rickson who organized all of this festival. We wouldn't have the festival without Will, so thanks, Will. And I see a great quote on the screen.
Yes, I wanted to finish with this, and my email address is there. I'm also on LinkedIn, so people can come and chat to me there as well.
Thank you.